Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video I'm going to show you how to make an HTTP or HTTPS request in Node.js. So for doing this we will see two ways. One is to use standard HTTP or HTTPS library which comes bundled with Node.js modules, and other is the request module which is much more user friendly. So let me go to Visual Studio Code. I have written some sample code. Let me go ahead and tell you what this is doing. So what I have done is I have first taken a reference to the imported HTTPS module, and then I'm defining a method called or function called start demo, and you can see I've called start demo at the end of this file, right? So whenever I execute this file, node test.js start demo is the method that gets run, and inside this I am executing this particular function which says execute HTTPS, and I am passing a callback to this method which is this callback, and then it goes ahead and executes HTTPS request and returns me the response. So let's see what is happening in HTTPS request. So first we need to define a set of options which specifies whether what is your host name, what is your port, what is your path, what is your method, and if the headers of your API request if you have any, right? Finally, you say HTTPS dot request, you pass these options, and then define a function where you will get your response. And as you can see, I'm printing the status code, I'm printing the response headers, and then I'm concatenating the body, and finally on response.onEnd I get the full response that is returned by the API, right? Now this is very important. So these are two listeners, event listeners. So data is basically whenever some data or some chunk of data is received by HTTPS request, we get this callback, in which what we are doing is we are just concatenating each chunk so that we get hold of the complete response. And when the end event is fired, that is when the entire response is received by the Node.js code. Then we go ahead and process the actual further processing that is required by the API call, right? And finally we have an error event as well. In case there is some error with the API, calling the API, then we basically make the callback using that particular error. So now that we know what this is doing, let's go ahead and try to execute this. So this is my directory, and you can see test.js is the file. So if I execute node test.js, you can see that starting demo code, status of API call 200. It gives some headers that is of the response that we received, and then we have the body of the API call. Now the body is really huge because it gives a lot of HTML content. So to keep it short, I'm just printing the length of the body, right? But it is very important to make sure that you process the response of the data only at the end event and not on the data, right? Because if you have a small data, it will work on this, but that's not a good scenario to have, right? Because the response that is returned by the server may vary, right? So you should always accumulate the data on the on data event and then finally process it on end event, right? Similarly, if you want to do an HTTP call, you can similarly do this. You can say you require HTTP. Now this is for HTTP calls. Now let's call the same function, but there are some things that will change in option. So instead of port 443, which is for SSL, which is HTTPS, we will say port 80, which is generally for HTTP request. Rest of the stuff remains same. Now all we have to do is call the HTTP module that we have imported instead of the HTTPS module, right? So rest of the stuff remains the same, and let's go ahead and let me clear this and then execute it again, and you can see that the response is slightly different now. This is because we are now calling HTTP endpoint of the server instead of HTTPS endpoint, right? And this is in fact my blog's URL, which is open source for geeks.blogspot.in. So it supports both HTTP as well as HTTPS variants, right? So HTTP and HTTPS are modules that are inbuilt with the Node.js, so you don't have to do anything explicit, install the dependencies and stuff. It comes packaged when you install Node.js on your machine, so it will work fine uh, once you have Node.js installed. Now let's move on to the second approach that I just mentioned, which is using the request library. So if you go back, uh, so this is the same code that I just demonstrated. I have added it on my GitHub just as well. But to go to the request library, so you will need to install an external library called npm install request. And if you go to uh, related links, you can see that there is a package called request, and this is where you have. So to install this, all you have to do is go to the directory and just install npm install request, right? And so once that is done, so updated one package, this is because I have already done it, but once that is done, you can go to node modules directory that gets automatically created. So you can go to node modules and you can see there should be a package called request. So let me just do a grep request, and you can see there's a request module right there, right? So let's go back to our code and see how request module works. So instead of calling execute HTTPS, I have already written a module called execute request, and I'm just going to do that over here. So let's call execute request now, send a callback. Now execute request is a little more user friendly than HTTP or HTTPS modules. So all you do is call request, you pass the URL, you pass the method, you pass the headers if you require, and all you do is call the functions, right? So you don't have to worry about HTTPS, HTTP or stuff like that, right? And in the response, you get a single callback in which you get the response as well as the body, right? And I have added check to see if there was error. If there was error, you print the error and call the callback using that error. If not, you just return the callback with the body, right? So so one thing that we need is to import it. So let's say request, sorry, request require request, right? As we saw, this was an external dependency that we had to install. So we now imported that module, and then we are calling execute request, in which you can see that it basically calls the request module. So let's go ahead and try to run this now and see how it works. So I'm just going to say node gets, and you can see that it printed the actual length and it worked. Now if you want to do the same thing with HTTP, you can just go ahead and change it. You don't have to worry about it, and you can see this is the same body length that we got in HTTPS. So you can either use the inbuilt HTTPS module, or you could use request and get it to work, right? So it's that easy. So coming back to some other stuff, so this was for get. For post, you need to do a little bit more. So let me show you how it works with post. So for post, you need to change the method name to post, and then you need to give the content length, which is your post data. And finally, before you do request.end, which is right over here, you say request.write post data, right? That is when you write your data to the API. So not all APIs would always return data, but they would expect some data to be sent in the request as well, and this is how you can do it, right? For get, it is fairly simple because those are query parameters and that will be part of the URL. But in post, it could be a form data, right, or URL encode data, and that could go over here, right? Similarly, in request library, if you want to do post, again, there is a parameter called body that the request text, again, the first argument, as you can see, is the option. Second is the callback. So you can define method as post and give the payload or whatever data that you have as the body, and then that would work, right? So there are two ways you can make an HTTP call or HTTPS call using Node.js. One is to use the standard HTTPS library, and there are other one is to use the request module. There are other modules available as well in Node.js that you can use, but these are like fairly simple and should suffice most of your requirements. So thank you.